Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master, Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was... Nobody expects the Torque Inquisition.
Welcome, everybody. We are here back with a new episode of the Torque Inquisition, our detour into interviewing smarter and more intelligent people than us. Well, than me, at least. I won't speak for you, Michael.
You can speak for me.
Okay, awesome. Well, you don't need to be on. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Today we have the we have the pleasure, the privilege of speaking with Professor Nick Groom, who is the author of the upcoming book Tolkien in the 21st Century: The Meaning of Middle-earth Today. I think it comes out September 5th. If I'm not mistaken, on Pegasus Books. Professor Groom is the professor of, let me get this right, because this is important, professor of literature and English at the University of Macau right now. Is that right? And you've also held positions at the universities of Chicago, Stanford, and Exeter, where you hold an honorary professorship. And I think most impressively, you taught the only undergrad course in Tolkien in the UK. Is that right?
So yeah, for some years, I've since found out that there were other people quite rightly doing so. But we had a dedicated course when I was at Exeter. It actually started when I was at Bristol. I decided to introduce Tolkien to a course, and it worked really well. And then I thought, when I got to Exeter, well, let's see whether we could do a whole course. And it's an introduction to Anglo-Saxon and Middle English, but it's focused very much on Tolkien, and also, of course, takes in the films. I'm now actually teaching out at Macau.
Okay.
So and I can certainly say it's the only one in East Asia.
For sure. Well, we could spend the entire episode talking about why every school doesn't have an undergraduate course in Tolkien. I think it would be a valid thing to go ahead, Michael. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to remark that it is to build on what you're saying, Jonathan. It is sort of maybe more expected nowadays than one would think, but Tolkien has sort of gone from sort of a fringe subgenre of literature back in, at least when my parents and in-laws were growing up, to now being a cultural icon across cultures, a cross-cultural icon. And his works have been, and this is largely the subject of your book, Dr. Groom, is that his works have essentially been taken on by the culture itself. And now here in the 21st century, there's been blossomings of all sorts all over the place in every sort of media. And what I would hope to, and I'm going to return, my theme in my questions is going to be to sort of get at the heart. And I did read, I haven't finished the book. I've read most of the book by this point, but get at the heart of what you think are the enduring qualities that Tolkien brings that allow his work to be so adaptable to everything from movies and theater productions and video games and the world. We were just talking before we started recording about how ubiquitous the memes. You cannot escape Tolkien memes online, and it's almost become part of the language of millennial generation, Gen Z. And there were even those that have never read the books. They feel very familiar. Tolkien is like a familiar companion, friend, or maybe the neighbor across the street who you don't get along that much with. But Tolkien has become a thread in the culture, who's almost unremovable at this point.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, we'll jump into that. Before we do, I do have to shout out our supporters. Harrison, Adam, Lynn, and Chuck, who give us a little bit more. They're the top tier of supporters. They're the what's the word you always use, Michael? The freeloaders. They are the pay for loaders, I guess. But they're the really ones. But then we also have our $4 members per month. You guys help us keep the lights on here. Help us pay for this system we're using, StreamYard, and all the other stuff. So we thank you very much. We are going to do an extended podcast. Oh yeah, go to theonering.com/member for that. We're going to do an extended podcast here with Professor Groom. And we're going to talk about, I think, more in depth about the films, some thoughts about that. And I'm sure, there's so much here we can talk about. We could probably go for hours, but it's a lot later for Nick over there. across the pond, and but we'll get into that. We'll get into the Rings of Power still. We'll get into, but there's so much detail in the book, so we're going to pick and choose some things. So I don't think it's going to be quite as free flowing as it could be, because man, we'd be here for hours. But if you want to hear more, stay tuned for our extended podcast, and go to thewondering.com/member to get that.
And perhaps we should actually tell what Dr. Groom's book is called, the title.
I already said that.
Did you?
Were you not listening?
I'm
Yeah.
not I'm a freeloader today.
So first off, though, before we talk about Professor Groom's book, Tolkien in the 21st Century, The Meaning of Middle-earth Today, coming out on September 5th, 2023 on Pegasus Books. Happy Michael. I want to know, how did you get started in Tolkien? What was, like we talked with Ted Naismith a few weeks ago, and he talked about how his sister gave him the book. Like, where did you get this love and this desire to make it like a literary pursuit for you, where you truly, you are teaching people Tolkien, you were talking about it, you're thinking about it, you're reading about it, you're seeing the influences of it. How did you get started, and how did you get to where you are?
Okay, so it took a long time. I remember when I was 8 years old, there was a school reading competition, and somebody in my class, I still remember it very distinctly, read the opening of The Hobbit as his reading piece. And I thought, that sounds fantastic. I'm going to have to read this book. But it was in the school library, it was always out. And it was a couple of years before I read The Hobbit. And then I, of course, moved on to The Lord of the Rings. And so I'd read it when I was about sort of, I guess, 12. I'm trying to work it out in terms of the Ralph Bakshi movie. And read it and reread it as one does. And you can actually see from my school books that all the notes in the margins I was making changed from little doodles of Spitfires and Panzer tanks. They changed to Elvish depictions of, Mordor and Mount Doom and so forth. So I've still got that evidence there. And then, of course, there were one or two teachers at school who, were enthusiastic, but not in the English department, I have to say. They tended to be in sciences. So then I went to university, and in fact, went to Oxford, where, of course, Tolkien had been, and wanted to study Tolkien. No way. Absolutely no way. Oxford in those days had no Tolkien tourism. There was no Tolkien walking trails. People will not believe this, but when I was a graduate student still in Oxford, one of the local charity shops was selling Tolkien letters. They had them in the window. I could not afford them. I could not afford the £50 because I was living on a shoestring. I mean, a number of times I regretted that.
Right. Time to invent my time machine and go back and.
Yeah. Clearly, son Don had cleared out his filing cabinets and had just taken the stuff to the charity shop.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And so then I did graduate work, and I wanted to work on Tolkien, but no, you couldn't do that. I mean, Oxford still has some sort of antipathy towards Tolkien. It's improved. There's still sort of some sort of remaining concern. I mean, it was great for me because it meant that I had a class of Anglo-Saxon with somebody who actually had Tolkien examine his MLit thesis. So that was a nice connection.
Very nice.
Then I started my own university career and wanted to teach Tolkien. Again, in those days, no way, you couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I, got, moved around, got promoted. And eventually when I got to become a professor, I thought, hang on, why are people telling me what to do? Why can't I teach Tolkien?
You put the work in at this point.
At least try it for a class. And then, I found that, this sort of lifelong love and fascination really pay dividends. And there's so much in the books. I mean, there's always a risk when you come to try to teach something that you've loved, that you're going to find out that it was all sentimental, that it's to do with a certain time in your life, and it doesn't really stand up. But Tolkien, it was the opposite. The Tolkien, I've consistently found more and more things there, whether it's delving back into Anglo-Saxon medieval literature, whether it's thinking much more experimentally about the nature of narrative or storytelling or the novel, and its context in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, whether it's in terms of its relevance today. And then, of course, I realized that many of my students were coming to Tolkien through the movies. That added a whole new dimension, a very exciting dimension, I must say, to the course I was teaching, so we could actually look at how Peter Jackson had dealt with adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's a, I think it works as a course. There aren't many courses that can go from Beowulf to the Rings of Power. They can go from, that Anglo-Saxon period all the way up to the 21st century and have a consistent thread. And so they can teach students about literature, language, adaptation, reinvention, medievalism, the whole range of different cultural practices. And so I'm now in in a very privileged position of being able to decide, more or less what I can teach. I'm so pleased that it's as popular in East Asia as it was in the UK. So I've got great students at Macau.
That's interesting.
They often know more particularly about the films than I do.
It's wow. So in East Asia, there is no dearth of folks who want to join your class.
Oh no, it's a popular class. Get very good committed students, and they are very, very well informed. Very well informed. Wow. I talk about people who know the history of Middle Earth, 12 volumes like the back of their hand.
Wow.
So that's interesting, because I mean, it's almost like your book could also be, it's Tolkien for the 21st century, but Tolkien for the whole world in a way, right? It doesn't.
Well, I think that could well be a follow-up volume.
That's right. Yeah. At volume 2, we'll be here for it. So then let's jump into the book. It's called, make sure I get this right every time, Tolkien in the 21st Century, The Meaning of Middle-earth Today. So why this book? And what prompted you to want to write this? Because I think maybe the best way to look at it is I think, as you mentioned, it's a post-lockdown, post-COVID type of book. But what was the impetus for you jumping into this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's a book I've always wanted to write, but I've never sort of felt really in the position to do so. And I've had a very good relationship with a number of publishers, Oxford, Yale, and Atlantic. And it was Atlantic who suggested it. I mean, I'd already talked to Oxford about doing a book on Tolkien, and so it's going to take me a few years to think about it. But Atlantic said, Nick, you're the guy to do a book. Rings of Power is going to be released September 2022. Let's do a book to coincide with that. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was during lockdown. It was a very difficult period for very many people. I was teaching online for much of that period, and it suddenly seemed to be the right moment. It's a very tough book to write because of the restrictions, but it's one that's, I want to say this in the right way. That often creative writers say this, that they're driven by a diamond, by some sort of creative energy, and it's true of the best academic work that I've produced. It's not a struggle. Suddenly you just turn on the computer, you start thinking, and it flows. And I sort of felt that this book really flowed. It was the right time to write it. Part of the reason it was the right time to do so was because the book seemed to be speaking so profoundly towards the experience of pandemic restrictions, of despair, desolation, isolation, loneliness, the changes in everyday life, which makes things seem sort of like strange, and the remoteness for one's friends and family. That's particularly acute, in the UK and in Macau. But I think it was the experience of many people across the world. And it really, for me, helped to revive the book and show that it wasn't just a brilliant piece of fiction and world building from the past, but it was very much about the 21st century. And that's when I then got interested in looking at the movies in very much more detail and thinking, how is it that these movies made 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and then being rebooted through the Rings of Power, hold such a fascination and such a hold over the imagination that they are now as significant, influential, as popular 50 years this year after Tolkien's death.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
2nd of September 1973, he died. He could never have imagined
No.
the esteem in which he would be held as a global writer, let alone the multi-billion-dollar industry that is.
I mean, it really didn't become popular until the mid '60s anyway. Until it was published, like popular in as part of the zeitgeist, until it was illegally published here in the U.S. in a paperback.
Exactly. Yeah. It was that illegal paperback that suddenly.
Yeah.
His publisher suddenly woke up to the fact that people wanted to read a book that was an expensive luxury 3-volume hardback, which most people read from the library at that stage. It sold solidly, but not well enough to be paperbacked.
Yeah.
Then they suddenly, George Allen Unwin and Houghton Mifflin suddenly realised that they've got a paperback bestseller on their hands. They hadn't really understood it. Of course, the ironic thing is that Tolkien then got hit with a massive tax bill.
and that's what he had to start thinking about.
That's one of the reasons why he then sold the film rights.
That's right.
And without that tax bill, so without the paperback, so without the illegal paperback, we wouldn't have the Peter Jackson movies.
It's like they were the Napster of 1965.
It's very, very strange because, of course, the estate's been very reluctant to license anything else, and Tolkien wasn't particularly keen on the cinema himself.
Yeah.
But once he started negotiating, he realised there was a chance to secure the future of his children and grandchildren, which is, of course, what every
That's true. Although I would have to say to you,
the consequences, I don't think. He was imagining a cinema world which was, Harryhausen, Disney.
Yeah.
And he couldn't imagine rotoscoping, let alone CGI.
That's right. And to you speak to your last point, it is interesting that the whole tenor has changed. The Tolkien estate went into a very lockdown mode. Although I think an interesting case can be made that was more of a function of the character of Christopher Tolkien than otherwise, because following Christopher Tolkien's passing, you see a difference in how the Tolkien estate is now treating the licensing of products. And so
it'll be really interesting to see how things develop in the next few years. And I completely understand Christopher Tolkien's position. He was very much the guardian, the custodian. He felt very keenly that he was a protector of his father's reputation and legacy and sort of creative achievement. And it clearly would have been a mistake to have sort of sold the rights too rapidly. And as we know from the rather checkered cinematic career of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings through the 1970s, it didn't really work out. But there are things to be said about those movies that in retrospect make them actually quite important steps on the way towards Peter Jackson's achievement and what we have today.
Yeah, in some sense, you almost need the false starts in order for folks to try to. I don't think, for example, in the next few decades anyway, anyone's going to try to remake Lord of the Rings as Jackson did it. I think it was successful enough that, but Jackson wouldn't have been where he was if the 1970s had produced a wonderful edition and a well-loved edition of the Lord of the Rings. So now people are turning to other aspects of the work. Nick, I wanted to go back to something you said, which was really interesting. It is tied into the whole theme of what I loved of the book, and wanted you to hear more commentary on, which was, you said that Tolkien would never have seen, the multi-billion-dollar industry. He would be probably quite surprised at the worldwide impact and that his books have had. And I agree with that. And I think that, of course, he couldn't have foreseen something like COVID, but yet you wrote this book. Part of the reason that you wrote this book was because the themes that the books address, and that therefore then the movies address, and in different ways, and other art addresses in other ways, music, actual visual arts, that these things had a resonance. My word, I guess, with the post-COVID mind that Tolkien couldn't have foreseen. What do you think? But there is something enduring about him. You don't get the sheer number of the amount of literature written about a work of a person like you do nowadays, whose works can't stand up to scrutiny, whose works are sort of flash in the pan, maybe an expression of a momentary cultural vibe, but in 10, 20 years, nobody cares. Tolkien, people have cared about for a very long time. And so it seems there is something more enduring there. I wonder if you could maybe tease out a little bit more of what you think is enduring about Tolkien's themes that make it so relevant to the 21st century. And of course, I would like to remind our viewers, please buy his book, and so that you can find out for yourself. But since they can't at this point, maybe you can give them a teaser as far as those enduring themes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it's one that's partly through the circumstances of when Tolkien was writing. First of all, Tolkien struggled throughout his life, particularly with money. And, we tend to think of him now, this waistcoated sort of tweedy Oxford don, comfortably well off. He was not comfortably well off until the very maybe last 4 years of his life. And, 2 of those years were spent with his wife, Edith, anyway. So he was very much sort of living on the edge. Although he was an Oxford professor, he had 4 children. He was working, he lived through 2 world wars. He had a very sort of difficult and rather sort of precarious life. Now, one of his great strengths, and something which I've become to understand and appreciate more and more, is something that other Tolkien critics have pointed out, such as Tom Shippey, says that Tolkien wrote without a plan. So, one of the things I always tell my students, if you're going to write an essay, plan it out. Know what your beginning, your argument is, where it's going to end. Unless you're writing a novel, because that's what Tolkien just did not do. He was exploring Middle Earth. He was trying to discover the plot. I mean,
he was discovering. That's right.
And so that's why, as people like Terry Pratchett have said, you feel that you're learning about the land at the same time, not only as the characters, but at the same time as the author is as well. Tolkien sort of famously sort of said, well, I started writing the sequel to The Hobbit, and these Black Riders have appeared. I don't know who they are.
Yeah, right. Or who Strider was at the time.
Exactly, don't know who Strider was. Strider, of course, as your viewers will know, was originally a hobbit called Trotter wearing wooden shoes. Thank goodness Tolkien revised, even if we don't.
The Dutch Hobbit, yep.
But then I think that's. I mean, some people say, well, Middle Earth is great because it's a very sort of self-contained, consistent world, and it's certainly very detailed, but it is not consistent. Mm-hmm. And it has so many loose ends. And that's the thing that began to interest me. It's had so many loose ends, so many false trails, so many unexplained aspects. Tolkien was exploring. And, it's like that fox who sees Sam and Frodo when they're leaving the Shire.
Right.
And we get a glimpse into a fox's mind. We never again get a thinking fox. No. The same thing, a bigger and more controversial example with Tom Bombadil. And Tolkien refused to explain, and he really said he didn't know who Tom Bombadil was, but he wanted to have that huge loose end.
Yeah.
When the hobbits finally get back to the Shire, Gandalf says he's going to go off and see Tom Bombadil, have a chat with him, rather than take the hobbits back into to encounter Saruman. So
that would have been a lovely conversation.
There's also a bigger example about this, the inexplicability, and that's the thing that made me think that the thing that makes Middle Earth realistic isn't the fact that it's all explainable, it's the fact that it's not all explainable. It has an internal logic, but it has lots of loose ends and lots of contradictions and lots of problems that don't really fit into the overall picture, and lots of things which then allow your own imagination to start working on that stuff.
Well, and I recently
it becomes limitless in that sense.
Recently reread, and we're going over On Fairy Stories in our podcast, which is fascinating because I agree with you. I think Tolkien has this amazing ability to create. I mean, he did world building like no other, first of all, but he has this amazing ability to be incredibly detailed and ordered. I mean, I'm thinking about his struggles with getting the timeline right, for example, of Fellowship, the whole Lord of the Rings, and he wrestled mightily with that and didn't even do it perfectly by the end, but nevertheless excellently, I think. So the detail was important to him, but he was also very comfortable leaving loose ends, like you say, leaving that creative openness there for others to come in. Even he even talks about he gives quotes about that, but so he had this balance, I find, between this world building and what else could he do, I say, because he believed in subcreation. He believed that this was the job of the true secondary artist of the secondary world, is to create. Well, if you take on a whole world that you're subcreating, you can't expect that by the end of it there's going to be code written for every angle of the story. It's going to have to be an endeavor which has so much openness and so many loose ends that and I can see that meshing very, very well with the 21st century zeitgeist. Speaking of which,
and also because he does it through character. So characters often have very strong opinions about how they think Middle Earth works, but who's to say they're actually right? And so they have their own views, and I mean, Gandalf is probably the most reliable witness. Although even he forgets his own name, which is not 100% reliable. So it's an indication, and I hesitate to use this comparison, but there is something Shakespearean about this. That Shakespeare only presents characters in his plays. Yes, he has the odd chorus, but he doesn't have an omniscient narrator. And Tolkien is not an omniscient narrator. He's a playful, mischievous, often deceptive narrator when he is a narrator, like in The Hobbit. But he really puts the opinions and the worldview into the mouths of his characters, and they're the ones who are trying to explain how things work. And they can only do so with through their own lens, through their own understanding, through their own frame of reference. I mean, a brilliant example of this is Sam, of course, who, it's wonderful to read Sam as he's traveling through Middle Earth because he's struggling to comprehend what's going on, and then reaches towards the old tales and the songs that he's heard in Rivendell, and he sort of, mythologizes himself within these sort of bigger tales, which is wonderful. That's what we all do. We sort of reach out to those legends and those other stories. Really. But the thing, it doesn't make it right. It just makes it a way of coping. And it's that way of coping that got me interested in how Tolkien can help us to think through some of the issues of the pandemic. Partly because there's a very dark Anglo-Saxon quality to this, which is, in the Battle of Maldon, the idea is that, you are going to lose, but you carry on. Because it's better just to stand up. You're not going to be victorious, you're not going to triumph, but it's at the same time, it's not a defeat to fall, but you will fail. And so much of particularly the Lord of the Rings is about failure. It's about failure, disappointment, and ultimately death. And so I sort of weirdly, that seemed to me to be quite consoling, that these are forces beyond your control. You can't control them, but it's important just to carry on. And that's right. In a sense, that's why he picks hobbits. That's why we don't, that's why we don't have a company of the ring, which is, Glorfindel and, Elros and, Aragorn. That's why we have 4 hobbits there, because they know how to carry on. And Tolkien, having, fought in one world war and lived through a second world war, that's actually more important. Just carry on, and that's the best you can hope for. You're not going to win. You are not going to win, but you're going to still be, have some sort of sense towards the end.
It reminds me of the Chesterton quote where he says, "You fight for what you don't fight because you hate what's in front of you. You fight for what you love that's behind you."
Well, I think what's behind you, though, what they all learn very, drastically, is that they can't save what's behind them because the world is irrevocably changed.
Right? They can't.
Frodo not only fails, but then he's instrumental in destroying everything he cares about.
And yet there are still, I mean, Tolkien makes heavy use of eucatastrophe. He loves that, of course. And so
it's absolutely brilliant, yes. But it's and then the brilliant eucatastrophe moment at Mount Doom, I think, is a sort of is a very, very powerful moment. But the book ends many times.
That's right.
It's interesting that we get that ending, then we get a series of other endings, and then we get the appendices. So the book,
much to the chagrin of
nobody reads the index. Who has read the index?
I found echoes of that when people who are not Tolkien fans or readers of Tolkien watch the movies, especially the extended editions, and they're thinking, the comment I would sometimes get is, didn't this movie end like 3 times? and the answer is, well, yes, that's in fact how Tolkien wrote. And
absolutely.
It was a series of endings. And there was, and this is a bad paraphrase of a Tolkien quote, but he did view the struggle as a series of long defeats. And that was his, it was an underlying theme of his, and yet punctuated by joy and wonder and eucatastrophe. Yeah. So you have this, you do have this fascinating contrast in Tolkien between that underlying philosophy and then but also the celebration and exploration of moments of real joy and beauty and wonder, as you mentioned, Nick, through the eyes of his characters most of all. But you can't help but think that Tolkien himself was also in kind of wonder at his own story as he's watching his characters.
I mean, you certainly get those moments of blissful enchantment, and I think Tolkien in one of the lessons does talk about the fact that the elves are still here. It's in the murmur of the wind in the trees or the sound of the stream. But apart from that, the enchantment. It's interesting in connection with the natural world. But that sort of idea of victory, it's not really the point. It's just the fact of needing to carry on, and the idea of it's a long defeat. That's fundamental to the character of Galadriel, and also I think to a lesser extent to Elrond. But it's also something that Tolkien says in his letters about Roman Catholicism. It's just history is not a history of progress. That's one of the things that makes Tolkien distinct from, this sort of like very British Whig idea of progress. That he sort of sees it as, rather as a series of catastrophic disasters, which just, leading towards some, sort of like dreadful end. But that's why the Anglo-Saxon spirit comes through. That you don't give up. You just carry on, knowing that you are staring in the face of inevitable and imminent defeat all the time. So weirdly, that is actually quite consoling. Particularly when you're faced with something as inexplicable as COVID-19.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Because you're not alone. You're not the only people who have stood here in history.
Well, then that is it. At no point when they're facing the long defeats do the characters face it alone. I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's even at Mount Doom, there's 2 of them. 3
exactly. It's a really brilliant point you just made. So I think it's really important to Tolkien that he's very much about camaraderie. Mm-hmm. It's about having groups of characters, even groups who don't get on, like Sam, Frodo, and Smeagol. It's that 3 or 4 in that group. Who knows?
3.5. Yep.
Yeah, 3.5. Good. Even the Company of the Ring is, it's riven with dissent from the moment they leave Rivendell. Mm-hmm. He knows there's, there is some consolation in community rather than going it alone. And he very rarely has those sort of single characters. I mean, sort of obviously, Turin is an example. It's become apparent that Galadriel's been presented as being a singular character in the Rings of Power, but generally they in Tolkien's canonical works they do tend to be together.
That would be an interesting study to me. Me as perhaps not as studied as either of you, but to look at these single characters who are defeated in the end. We can talk about Fingolfin and
Fingolfin. Yeah, I just said Fingolfin. That's really right.
Really?
Right. There's more going on with Turin, I agree.
Yeah.
But even Turin has a companion for the longest time until he kills him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which makes him go alone, and things don't get better from there on.
No, they do not.
Well, I wanted to. One of the things I wanted to jump into a little bit was something that I think a lot of people would look at the title of the chapter. I think it's called The Ambiguity of Evil, or just Ambiguity, Good and Evil. I'm trying to remember it. I'm trying to get there. I have the PDF.
The ambiguity of evil, hesitancy of good.
The Ambiguity of Evil, which is something that people don't explicitly say that there's ambiguity in the Lord of the Rings. There's people would say no, good and evil are very much well defined in there. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit and what
I don't think they are at all. I think they are. I think Tolkien is fascinated by how things work in the real world. He's not interested in the absolutes of good and evil. He's interested in sort of like essential, sort of like massive concepts. He's interested in how it works on the ground. That's why, I think Bilbo is such an interesting character in The Hobbit, because he persistently, lies and deceives and thieves. And, what can you use a ring of invisibility for? What's the moral good of invisibility? None at all.
Very little.
To be deceptive.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes much more significant in The Lord of the Rings, where he extends it into thinking about, everybody thinks, the environment's great, and everyone thinks the trees are lovely. Of course, we all know Tolkien's a tree hugger and so forth. But then the old forest almost destroys the antiquest before it gets going. They could have all ended up in the entrails of Old Man Willow. And even the Huorns, when we encounter them, and Treebeard says to Pippin and Merry, "You've got to stay out of the way of the angry Ents." This is, it's not a sort of placid, pastoral version of nature. It's a very aggressive, and it's also what I think speaks to us today is that it removes the human from the center of things. And one of the great things about The Lord of the Rings, in particular, and I think this is more so in that book than it is in his other writings, it is offering other perspectives. He's offering dwarvish perspectives, certainly Hobbit perspectives. He's offering wizard perspectives, but he's not assuming that everything is always human-centered. And in doing that, when Treebeard speaks, you see the capacity of the Ents for making sense of the world, but also the limitations. And so this is like a tree-based perspective on how we might think about the world. But we also see that it's not actually absolute. That it's got, they haven't heard of hobbits to begin with, which is a pretty sort of fatal oversight, I think. The passages where he gets into the mind of Gimli, I think, are amazing. When he's talking about, Gimli getting frightened in the paths of the dead. This is a dwarf who's grown up among rock and stone and mountains, and he's terrified. He's got what I call lithophobia. And this is lithophobia seen from the perspective of a dwarf. And then you get these wonderful passages where he describes how Gimli can't describe to Legolas the beauty of the
caves of Aglarond.
Yeah, the caves of Aglarond. Yes. Because there aren't the words in Elvish. They're not concept in Elvish to think about these sort of grottos of rock in the same way that there aren't words in Dwarvish to think about the beauty of trees, of Fangorn, and the organic sort of life there. And Tolkien's way ahead of we're only just beginning to catch up with him in that respect. I think that thinking about a world which is based on non-human perspectives. There's been a lot of sort of philosophical works written about thinking how does the world appear to a bat? How does it appear to a river or a tree? This is very much part of contemporary philosophy now, and sort of it's all implicit. It's implicit, it's not explicit. It's implicit in Tolkien because it's because he wasn't closing things down. And he wasn't a writer who was wanting to limit what he was doing. He was just letting it flow, letting it sort of open out and just like generate its own problems and contradictions and issues. And that's one of the great I'd say about his environmental writing. And so I'm often arguing with people about this, is that, no, the environment is not pleasant in Tolkien. You've got, Caratharas, who was evil long before Sauron was evil, for example. So you've got, you've got mountains, you've got forests, which are absolutely inimical to sentient life. The trees hate those that can walk. So it's not all like nice and cozy.
Even the trees that can walk hate those that can walk. What's always fascinating to me, again, to make the connection with on fairy stories, Tolkien is talking about the connection, how it's a fairy story gets capital F fairy story, requires the understanding that the world of fairy is utterly different from ours, and the denizens of fairy have different perspectives. They have different motivations. They don't even care about us that much, and above all, they're very perilous. It's dangerous to walk in their world because it is their world, and so and a true fairy story is an adventure that a non-fairy has, and the world of fairy, and I think he would consider Lord of the Rings to be a true fairy story, and where fairy exists in Lord of the Rings most of all, as you've pointed out, Nick, is the forest. You have the old forest, you have Lothlorien, which is perilous because of the elves that are there, and you have the Fangorn, of course, and in each case there's the perspective of Old Man Willow and Tom Bombadil in the old forest, who are different from each other, but they're very different from everybody else. And you have the perspective of the elves in Lothlorien, utterly so different from humans that the Rohirrim view them as basically witches and malicious. And then of course you have Treebeard, who makes it all explicit and says essentially no one looks from our perspective. There's no one standing up for us. This is an entirely different and other. So when I hear that,
a lot of people trust Treebeard, but he's wrong about that, because of course Gandalf is.
True, but Gandalf is an exception, though, right?
Well, certainly Saruman had been.
Gandalf and Radagast. So you got two people that care about him.
Radagast is one of those sort of like wayward characters. But also the interesting thing is about characters like Old Man Willow, or like the Barrow Wight, are not connected to Sauron either.
Correct.
Like Caradhras, there isn't some sort of like monumental evil, and the forces of evil are all enforcing forces of good. There are these sort of things that are inexplicable. It's like when Tolkien goes down below where the dwarves delved in Moria and found that there are further subterranean passages. This is the whole subterranean history of Middle Earth that we know nothing about. There are other, histories, other stories, other worlds there, and it's like the fell beast that where does Sauron get those from? And there's some sort of weird prehistoric hangover. So all the time I think he's presenting, as far as he can, and as far as we live our own lives day to day, we think that the world is consistent, but we know every day that the people disagree with us, that there are sort of like contradictions in the news, there are all these ambiguities, and he's just he's just brilliant, I think, capturing those in the context of Middle Earth, and that's what it makes it believable, because it's not consistent. It's not believable because it is consistent. It has the appearance of consistency, which is what he says about Beowulf. But it's not consistent because you don't know the back history of it.
Is this in Beowulf Monsters?
It gives the impression of deep history because it's got these references to other works, but we've lost the other works, so we don't know about them.
Yeah, that's really true.
It goes back to I'm going to bring this all the way back to when you said how you tell your students to when you write an essay, you have to create the structure for it. And how Tolkien, when he wrote his novel, he was discovering that as he went. But here's the difference that I want to bring up, and the kind of, and as you're saying, right, we are experiencing Middle Earth in a similar way that Tolkien wrote it. We're discovering it as he wrote it. But he had a world to walk through because he'd been creating it since 1915. 15. And so it wasn't like he just sat down to write. He sat down and he discovered all these places that he already knew about somewhat, but he just didn't know what was there. I mean,
yes, no. I mean, he'd written the history of the First Age in many different versions, but now he's writing a story that's based in the Third Age with a whole element of the rings that hadn't even occurred to him when he was writing the First Age stories.
Yep, isn't that interesting? Yep.
I think it's amazing that he's able to completely recast the Silmarillion based on the fact that he's discovered a new aspect of the story. I mean, he does this with The Hobbit, because the dwarves were originally evil characters in evil species. And I use the word species, and this is an important point in my book. They are species, not a race. They consist of different races. They're a species. So he began to rethink the dwarves after having written The Hobbit. And, The Hobbit is midway between Middle-earth and our world and becomes more Middle-earth, of course. Now, with the Lord of the Rings, that process continues because, yes, you're completely right that, the First Age stories were there and they do figure quite prominently in Beren and Luthien, in Turin Turambar, and so forth in the Lord of the Rings. But, the whole story of the Rings wasn't part of his original conception with the Book of Lost Tales or any of the sort of subsequent great tales.
Do you know then? I'm just curious. I don't know if I've ever had an answer to this question. Is how much of the Second Age was written before the Lord of the Rings? Because there's so much in there that ties right into the Lord of the Rings. Or was that like, for instance, Aldarion and Arendis, is that something he sat down and wrote and because it was interesting, has no bearing really? I mean, you could say the one comment about how he's sent back and he's a great elf friend and there's danger, we just don't ever find out what that is in that story. But how much of the Second Age was written before the Lord of the Rings? I don't think I've ever come across that.
I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I mean, clearly Numenor had been on his mind for many years.
Right. That started as that time travel story, right?
It's in the Lost Road.
Lost Road, right? Another
example. Although in that it develops into more of a sort of like Nazi sort of totalitarian state. And it's also it occurs in the Notion Club papers as well. Which this weird, not unfinished novel. He writes in the middle of the Lord of the Rings.
I know. As a challenge with C.S. Lewis, he's like, "We're just gonna have to you write the story, Chronicles of Narnia, and I'll write this time travel tale." Or he wrote right. It was he would write a sci-fi space story and then
the time travel story, which was Lost Road, and Lewis went off with the with the space travel story, but then the Notion Club was a sort of a distraction. I mean, he couldn't finish the Two Towers; he was sort of writing another novel.
he couldn't continue. Then he was taking the road not taken at that point in order to figure out what was going on in Middle Earth.
Well,
I think it's one of the reasons why Numenor haunts the Return of the King, particularly. He's trying to sort of like make sense of this. This dream he's having and this fascination he has with the sunken land.
That's right. And by the dream, you mean the dream of the wave overcoming the land that he's on. We had this persistent dream since childhood, right?
Which he had until he bequeathed it to Faramir, and then when he gives it to Faramir, he stops having it as a recurrent nightmare.
Whoa, I did not know that.
Well, that's what he claims. I mean, you've got to be quite. You've got to be a little bit skeptical when authors start telling stories.
He just dreamt. He stopped dreaming it. He dreamt about Faramir dreaming it, which might be.
But I really don't know how much the Second Age had been written, or mapped out. It's interesting that he thought it was important enough to include in the Tale of Years in the appendix of Lord of the Rings. So he clearly thought it was important.
That's true. So he did. Yeah. Well, I before we move into our extended edition, I do want to talk a little bit about the Rings of Power, because you do commit a section of this book to the Rings of Power, not necessarily as a review. I don't think but what's written is not written as someone who's watched it. It's written as an examination of what it could be or what it is in the. Okay. Correct me. Yeah.
The advanced copies that I think you two have received don't include this extra section.
Oh, okay. So I did misunderstand that.
Yeah. Good. So this the US edition, which has a slightly different title to the UK edition, but it's the same book, has this extra chapter, which will be in the UK paperback, and that covers the first season of the Rings of Power.
Oh.
So the last few pages of the first UK edition included comments from interviews with the actors and the showrunners and so forth, of what could be gleaned. But there is going to be a new chapter in the US and the UK paperback edition coming up in September, which is my first thoughts on the Rings of Power.
Okay, well, I will be completely honest, and and I'll preface this by saying I did not like the Fellowship of the Ring when I saw it in 2000. I thought it was 2001. I thought it was disastrous in my head. And granted, I was much younger. I was nearly so. You know why? I was sitting next to my sister-in-law at the time, who was just newly married to my brother. And once they hit Rivendell, she's like, "Is it over?" It's like they're going to go on. And then we hit what people on our forums back in the day called nuclear Galadriel. We hit that, and she's like, "Oh, she's evil." I'm like, "No, she's not evil." And then Aragorn. There are these things. There are these sort of these touchstone moments that ruined my experience. I've come around in the meantime, particularly by the end of Return of the King. I'd come around and I enjoyed the films, but my perspective, for good or ill, has always been very, the word that's thrown around is always purist. And so watching The Rings of Power is very difficult for me because it is completely different than what Tolkien wrote in the Second Age. And so, for lack of a better term, we kind of savaged it because we just didn't. I just couldn't stand it. And in the same way, like, I didn't like The Hobbit at all either, because it was felt such when it takes longer to watch the films than read the books, it feels like something's gone wrong. And so The Rings of Power, similarly, they do things I think they didn't need to do, which is compress the timeline. I think they could have done what other shows do, is they could have the same through line of particular characters and then change the humans, so to speak. But I just, like, I'd love to get your insight on it, and clarity rather than agreement in this situation. Like, people can love it, that's great, but we can agree to disagree on certain things. I'm just curious, like, what was your take on The Rings of Power? And you've talked to the actors and perhaps some of the directors, the crew. What was your take on?
No, I haven't talked to anybody directly. I was just taking quotes from interviews. I mean, I'd really love to talk to people involved, but they're not very easy to get access to.
No.
If I could just it's just preface what I'm about to say with a comment that the book I've just written tends to focus on the works published in Tolkien's lifetime. So that's one Tolkien.
Yeah.
The Tolkien who, with regards to Middle Earth, published The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, the Songs of Tom Bombadil, which nobody ever talks about. And that's pretty much it. And there are a few letters in newspapers and interviews and so forth. Then he subsequently said a great deal in private correspondence. And we now know, because there are sort of 18 volumes of Middle Earth books being published, plus the Silmarillion, of course, which he wanted to publish. But
Tolkien in the next few months, I think, too, with something like 40 new letters.
I mean, there have been a lot of these letters floating around the internet for a while as well.
Yeah.
For auction sites and so forth. But one of the criticisms that I had from, very sort of, informed Tolkien fans was saying, well, you say that sort of, Frodo and Bilbo go off to Valinor and are therefore, immortal. But in his letters, he later says this. I said, well, he might say that in his letters, but he doesn't say that in his printed works during his lifetime. So, we were dealing with what do the books say? Mm-hmm. Trust the work, not the author, as T.S. Eliot said. Or what the author subsequently says 15 years later in a private letter, or in notes that aren't published until 20 plus years after his death. So that's the first thing. And I think that's a bit of a sort of it's a tripwire, really, that you can learn a huge amount about Middle Earth from reading the history of Middle Earth and the other volumes. But how is it reflected in the works that were published and made his name, and which took you to those works in the first place?
So technically, would you include the Silmarillion as part of the works that he wrote in his lifetime? Because there's the whole argument about Christopher Tolkien and Guy Kay working on it.
I know, and it's and in the version they produced, I mean, it was fairly rapidly came into criticism because of the role of Galadriel, for example, that was very much played down. And the Silmarillion is a real problem. We all would have loved Tolkien to have published a version of it, but the reason why he didn't is because he couldn't finish it, and he couldn't finish it because he kept on changing the characters. And one of the main characters is the role of Galadriel. If you read the earliest versions, you see how different the characters, the conflicts are, the whole presentation, the whole tone is very different. So you know, it means it's great fun for us all to argue about now. But I think
that's why we have a podcast. So let's appreciate that just a little bit.
But I think we also need to bear in mind that you got to give some integrity to the books that were published in his lifetime and how, you know, they were received, and that's
Precisely. Yes, and I'm a huge fan of that. Of the a good work stands to its own interpretation without what the author might say afterwards or beforehand, or even while, you know, in ancillary communications while he's creating or she is creating. So that I'm a big fan of that. But I recognize there's sort of three Middle Earths in a sense. There's the published Middle Earth that Tolkien, as you spoke to. There's the Middle Earth that is formed of all the ancillary literature, the biggest chunks of which were gathered by Christopher and the various folks that worked with him, and that we're now privy to through his Tolkien's own thought process. So it's Middle Earth in this sort of cloudy, expanded way in the way I look at it. And then there's the third Middle Earth, which I find fascinating in your book, which is the third Middle Earth, and you don't get a whole lot into it because you do spend an unbelievable and amazing amount, kind of wondrously bewildering swirl of summary of Tolkien's life. I loved your treatment of how you, in a very personal way, followed the patterns of his life. But there's this third Middle Earth, which is the product all great literature produces in people who experience it, a reaction to a greater or lesser extent, a reaction where we want to interact with it and maybe create along with it. And so you have things like the films in the 70s, and then the Jackson films. I'm a big gamer. I've played Lord of the Rings online since 2007, and so the world of video games and how that interacts. The world. I mean, we're about to have War of the Rohirrim come out, which is a different kind of visual medium.
You know what it is? Can I say? Let's define it. Like, I think in Fairy Stories, he said it's not the world you believe in, it's the world you desire. It's like the desired Middle Earth is kind of what you're talking about. It's the one that we
right. And because there are other desiring agents than the author himself,
right? That's right.
Then you have this third Middle Earth, which is the product of, and it can have a life of its own, and it can express itself very differently from the way Tolkien. I guarantee you, if Tolkien were alive and forced to write a story about the second age in Galadriel, he would not have written what the Rings of Power writers wrote. He would have written something different.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. But the thing is, I mean, what's interesting in terms of that third world, I think you're quite right, and that's exactly how I'd phrase it myself. That there is this sort of third Tolkien world, but it's also very consistent because Peter Jackson, the films are very aware of what went before in terms of the radio adaptations, the earlier movie treatments, even the films that weren't made, such as the John Boorman movie, which I think is fascinating. For all I remember going to see the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, released in the US in '78, released in the UK in '79. I'd already read the book at least twice, and being horribly disappointed by it because it just did not live up to
that's me
what
too.
I hoped
me too.
Having thought about it again, in the context of writing this book, I realized what he was trying to do. He was an experimental filmmaker, and Tolkien is an experimental writer. And what the studios were trying to do was to get somebody who was cutting edge, edgy, experimental, to do something different that would push cinema in a new direction. It turned out that rotoscoping wasn't the answer, although Bakshi's films before and after were actually, pretty good. Let's not talk about Fritz the Cat.
Yeah, no.
That's fine. But this is not the show for that.
Right. Something similar, however, happens with Peter Jackson because of his, commitment to developing the way to workshops, to using CGI and mocap, also to working outside of Hollywood, in New Zealand, but also being acutely aware not only of Tolkien's own writings, but of the Bakshi version of the BBC radio adaptation of the Rob Inglis audio book, and also of those earlier animations, even the earliest Hobbit movie, I think. He actually was able to build on all of that. So there's a real canon of this sort of third Tolkien, as I think you quite rightly described him, in which these aren't independent productions. they're very aware of what's going on, and then the Peter Jackson materials gets deliberately built into the video computer games, through all the authors voicing extra stuff and through the representation. And with the Rings of Power, we see endless acknowledgements and references to the Peter Jackson movies. In fact, more so sometimes than to Tolkien's own work. They are very sort of deferential. They're very aware that they're part of this tradition, which I think is rather wonderful. They're very respectful. It's a very respectful series. And you're quite right that Tolkien would not have written Galadriel in the same way. But then, Tolkien died 50 years ago, sadly. What does he know about what 12-year-old girls want in the 21st, in 2023? My daughters are thrilled by Galadriel. I think Galadriel is a really complicated and difficult character. And that's one of the things I say is that, she's, absolutely thrilling for a teenage girl to watch. One of the great things about the Rings of Power is they've got strong female leads that are not sexualized. You've got Bronwyn, Nori, Miriel, Disa, and obviously Galadriel. They're great role models. Yeah. And they're not sort of. You look at the sort of the sort of fantasy female superheroes of the 1970s. They're all wearing sort of skimpy bikinis and sort of fighting, trolls wearing virtually nothing. These are genuinely complex female characters. Tolkien was a great supporter of female education, of female opportunity in academia, and I think he would have approved, but he wouldn't have done it in the same way, in any sense. But I think that you have to write for your audience today, rather than trying to produce a bit of what might have happened in the sort of 1950s.
So this is where probably is a place where I disagree is a strong word, where I take a different perspective. I feel like no, I hate saying those words because it doesn't give me any sort of authority. Tolkien wrote strong women, particularly in the First Age. You could say Haleth would be one. Yeah. Even Nienor was one. Melian, all the Varda, and so there were many strong characters. What I feel like we get in today's culture is strong woman means she can carry a sword and be a big man. So, for instance, in the Rings of Power, the very first scene we get with Galadriel is her slaying the snow troll or the ice troll, whatever.
Snow troll,
yeah, and not having it's not a struggle at all. She's perfect already. She can destroy it, and everybody else can't do anything. And so I feel like what they're doing immediately is setting her up as the male equivalent. It's kind of like, remember the Ghostbusters movie from 2018 where they're like, we're just going to take all the men and make them into women, and it's just like no.
But except then she's shown to have really deep flaws, and that's when the Rings of Power got interesting for me. I did start watching it when I was actually in quarantine, and it didn't really work in quarantine. I was trying to get back to Canada. And I watched it, as I said, I watched the whole season 3 times now. Mm-hmm. What's really interesting is that these characters aren't presented as being, ideals of, fighting prowess or of sovereignty or of leadership. Galadriel's a fundamentally flawed character in the Rings of Power. She's got no diplomatic skills. She's got an absolutely towering sense of her own entitlement. She's unbelievably arrogant. What a great character! What a brilliant character!
So I would agree with you, Nick, if that character didn't have a different vibe from the Galadriel that we even catch hints of in Tolkien's
but we do. That's one of the nice things. One of the nice things about Rings of Power is, Galadriel, when she talks to Frodo, she says, I know the Dark Lord's mind. This is one of the things that the showrunners themselves said, that they based, that they took hints. Mm-hmm. How does Galadriel know the Dark Lord's mind? Well, she must have known it. And you get this wonderful, which I thought were really effective, overlaps. When, the first thing that Halbrand says to Galadriel on the raft is what Galadriel then later says to Frodo at the Mirror of Galadriel.
Sure. Yeah.
So it is. I say it's deferential. It's referential. It's ignoring sources, but it's also you're dealing. They're taking 150 pages from the appendices. and trying to turn it into a massive.
Right.
It has very little to do with Tolkien, and
Agreed.
I'm the first to admit that. But you know, you want it to stand on its own,
Okay.
Merits. Is it entertaining fantasy
Yeah.
television? I'd say it's way better than Game of Thrones, which I found to be brutal, cruel, amoral, and dark,
Just like the books.
rewarding. Whereas the Rings of Power is, we all know that it ends in defeat. We know that already.
Yeah.
But it's about loyalty and, also false loyalty. It's about sort of friendship, and also about false friendship, and deceit. And I think that if you just watch it on its own merits, then it's entertaining and it's meaningful. If you watch it bearing and knowing everything that your viewers will know about the film,
well,
then it's never going to measure up. But
and that's the.
Is that a fair way to? It's also very much about issues of isolation. In that sense, it's about COVID, but it's also about political isolationism and the fact that you cannot be isolated. It begins with these isolated units, like the Southlanders and like Numenor, and it shows that isolationism as a political ideology is disastrous.
Well,
it's much more positive, much more sort of liberal in its politics, I think.
Where I will disagree, I can see those themes. I can see the themes that you're mentioning, Nick. I would disagree in the delivery. I don't think they pulled that off very well. I think, especially with Numenor, I think their treatment of Numenor was rather two-dimensional, and the Numenor that was it's extant in the works of the second Tolkien world, or even a bit of the first Tolkien world, is so much, I think, more worthy of almost its own season of Rings of Power. That's what I was hoping for. I was hoping they were going to do a season on Numenor, but
it's part of the sort of the practicalities. It's one of the things that sort of Peter Jackson does very well, is he has the parallel plot lines running through, particularly Lord of the Rings, and he learned that from Ralph Bakshi, because if you start comparing Peter Jackson's screenplay with the actual Tolkien's novel, you'll realize that sort of Tolkien will have chapters and chapters and chapters about Rohan and Helm's Deep and the Ents and so forth before we even get back to Frodo and Sam. Now, Peter Jackson doesn't do that because he learned from Ralph Bakshi. I mean, another famous example would be introducing Gandalf's encounter with Saruman at Isengard as the hobbits are leaving the Shire. That's taken almost frame for frame from the Ralph Bakshi movie. And, that's one of the things that's, Ralph Bakshi only got some things wrong, but he knew how to pace a movie. And that's got carried on. And then there are sort of various iconic scenes. So I think, he may well have worked having a whole season on Numenor, but, on the other hand, why not just have the 4 or 5 plot lines running together? Because you've always got, that's how people watch, that's how people consume, visual media these days. They want to have those intercuts between the different stories.
Agreed, but I think you could have had 4 or 5 different plot lines at the time of Numenor in the Rise. There's so much to Numenor in the Rise, but let's leave that aside for a second. I like what you said earlier, which is that essentially Rings of Power has very little to do with Tolkien per se. It is that third world, and in that third world of Tolkien, you can have a Jackson version which accords much more with the books, and you can have an Amazon version which accords much more with something else that they had in mind when they're making it, or the way to bring Tolkien as a reflection of 21st century thought patterns and present Middle Earth in that frame, which I think is much more of what they're doing.
If you forgive me, Mike, I will say the Jackson films work really well because they appear to conform to the books, but of course they don't.
Well, there's quite a few places they don't, but what do you think of?
Yeah, for reasons we've just said in terms of, the intercutting of the Gandalf-Saruman scene, but also, the whole bit where sort of Elrond visits Aragorn before he's going to go on the paths of the dead. I mean,
no, that
the whole reforged Gymnasium.
Right, right, and the Lothlorien elves slaughtered in Helm's Deep, and all sorts of the replacing of some characters for another, and the pseudo death of Aragorn in order to have cinematic end to the Two Towers, and
exactly,
you can go. You in fact, we're coming out.
We're prepared to forgive Peter Jackson those changes or revisions or adaptations. I remember when I wasn't going to go to see the Fellowship of the Ring because I thought that it was going to be like the Ralph Bakshi experience. And then I saw a documentary, something in Britain called the South Bank Show, and I was just absolutely awestruck by the visual quality that it managed to make the unimaginable, imaginable, present, visual. And so then I went and I enjoyed it thoroughly, but I also realised that it's a far cry from the book. And everyone will have their. I mean, I think they're a wonderful series of films, and I think they're a huge success. I mean, they're a major cinematic achievement.
Yeah.
But if you press me, then I'd say, where's Tom Bombadil? Where are the Barrow Wights? Most importantly, where's the Scouring of the Shire? Let alone all the other plot divergences. But it works.
Yeah.
It works really well on the screen. And it's lovely to see my children who are enjoying it and getting completely obsessed with the tiniest details. They're quizzing me about Daddy, what's Theodred's horse called?
Oh no, I don't know that.
If it works, then I think it needs to be, recognised. And I think that we've got to give the Rings of Power a little more time. We've just finished season 1. They're putting a huge amount of imaginative energy into it. It's not going to be Peter Jackson rebooted, in the same way that Peter Jackson wasn't actually Tolkien rebooted. But on its own merits, I think we need to give it a bit more time and see how it pans out. And I mean, having watched it 3 times, I think forget Tolkien maybe. It just it's an enjoyable, thought-provoking, and often very moving.
Yeah. This is where. Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead. Before I jump in,
I was just going to say I don't expect anything from Rings of Power in terms of being able to match Tolkien. I don't expect it to even be the same as Jackson's films. I don't want it to be. I want it to be something creatively different. The question I will have at the end of it is: were they able to capture? To bring this back to a parallel to your book, Nick. There's something about Tolkien that one finds to be appropriate in 21st century, in the third decade of the 21st century, in our experiences. There's a series of universal qualities. I think you laid some of them out very nicely earlier in this conversation. Will Rings of Power, when it's done, when you look at the body, will it bring that same feeling? Will they be able to convey some of that to its audience in a way that creates a love for Middle Earth in its audience? And if it does so, then I will admit my error in my opinion of season 1. But it's got a tall hill to climb.
I can give you one example which tries to tie all of those 3 experiences together: Lord of the Rings as a novel, the Peter Jackson movies of Lord of the Rings, and the Rings of Power. We talked earlier about how Tolkien didn't know where he was going, how much uncertainty, what I call hesitancy, ambiguity there is in the novel. Peter Jackson was able, perhaps partly by accident, but was able to replicate that by filming every scene in many different ways. So the actors didn't know of their character development. And it's a bit like Casablanca, the movie Casablanca, where nobody knew how it was going to end.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are acting in a bit of a different way. They're acting in a more sort of hesitant, exploratory way because of that. Because there's a sort of you all know the medieval idea of the cloud of unknowing. There's a sort of
yes,
profound uncertainty and mysticism about this. And I think that's one of the reasons for the Peter Jackson films being so good. Is because he didn't know what was going to happen. The actors definitely didn't know. And that is part of it gets communicated to the audience, and also because the extended editions have different takes of the same scenes than the theatre edition has. So even watching the same film in 2 different versions, it's going to be a different experience. Now, The Rings of Power does that to a certain extent because they did not tell Charlie Vickers, who plays Halbrand, who he really was until halfway through the filming.
Mm-hmm.
So he's playing it in one way, then he suddenly realised who he really is. And as soon as my 13-year-old daughter finished it, and I, thankfully there hadn't been any spoilers, she said, "We're going to have to watch that all over again, aren't we?"
You got to look like, yeah. It's one of those.
It's a bit like Emma by sort of Jane Austen. It's, it completely changes the whole everything that sort of he says. Now that's really great. I think that's a great piece of televisual direction to do that. It's a really great piece of great example of sort of script writing. If they can continue with those sorts of uncertainties, then I think it'll be really exciting. There probably won't be such a huge reveal as Sauron, but they're clearly capable of being pretty deft with a plot. Fingers crossed.
I think they have the money.
I want it to be a success. I think
I said originally when they released that first image of Finrod looking at the two trees.
Yeah, wonderful.
Back like January, February of last year. I was like, that is a great rendition of it. And it started off so well for me. And I am like, by default, I'm a critical person, and I acknowledge that. And so it takes me a while to warm up to something. I'm going to have a hard time warming up to this because I know so much, like you said before, about what Tolkien wrote or what was in that second world and all the ancillary papers. And then I have problems with.
They can't really use that. They can't make it.
I know
that's one of their major problems. Is they can't.
I keep saying I want what I really want long term is I want to see the story of Turin Turambar, but I don't think anybody's ever going to touch that. So
there's some wonderful fan trailers on YouTube that you doubtless know about with the Silmarillion in sort of 4 parts, and it's just you just see the possibilities.
Yeah,
but until the film rights are released, which might not ever happen, and then you want to get the right people doing it because
exactly.
The Peter Jackson, Alan Lee aesthetic has been impressed so profoundly upon the cinematic realization.
Before you make a point, Michael, the one point I think about the Rings of Power, where if I were to say the reason that for me it lacks some of the passionate fervor that's around Peter Jackson's films, for instance, is that it was created as a corporate exercise and not a passionate exercise. So Jackson came and he worked hard to sell it. He first went to the Weinstein Company. They wanted 2 films, and then he went to Bob Shea, New Line. He's like, weren't there 3 books? And then they made 3 books, and he worked hard to make this happen. Yeah. And I think the Rings of Power, like Star Wars now, it lacks. There's not a passionate person and a personality driving it forward no matter what, because it's become a corporate exercise. I think you see that a lot in a lot of other cultural, particularly in Hollywood now, because it is so corporate now. And I miss a little bit of that. Maybe that's wrong. I'm willing, but I think that's part of it, where it lacks a little bit of the resonance that it would have if it had that sort of passion behind it. I don't know.
It lacks the back.
I think it's worth remembering that the Peter Jackson films, there are 3 films in extended editions of 3.5 hours each. Whereas we only had the first season of the Rings of Power, which is 8 episodes of an hour each, and we've got more seasons to come. So, I think Tolkien was always a collaborator.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not forget. He was reading out Lord of the Rings to the Inklings. It was C.S. Lewis who really sort of like made him finish it.
Yes, right.
He wasn't a sort of like a single auteur.
No, that's true.
He really relished. He was a huge supporter to other academics, particularly female academics like Simon Diane, for example. So I think that he would have seen the value in a team effort.
Yeah. I hope
to Milton Waldman. He also talks about seeing his Middle Earth as an area for other people to explore and develop, and develop their
other minds and hands. quote.
Other minds and hands,
Yeah. Well, I think, when you come out with volume 2 of the 21st Century Tolkien, maybe the Rings of Power will have a couple of more seasons and we can talk about it at that point. But yeah,
I certainly don't want to offend any of your viewers. So it's hugely controversial. It's hugely controversial.
How are we supposed to learn anything good and new if we're not willing to challenge ourselves into whatever it is that we believe anyway? So we got to.
I think it's worth watching, even if it irritates. If it irritates you to death, I think you need to be part. You need to be part of the debate.
Yeah, I
mean, controversy is good for the clicks too. So
it's true. I know. It feels so bad.
There's nothing wrong.
Honestly,
nothing wrong with disagreeing on it. I am interested. I'm very interested in reading the version that comes out with your reaction to season 1 when it comes out, and then we'll have to maybe do a redux once season 2 comes out and catch thoughts.
Sure.
And
sure.
have a real sit down. Shall we shift over?
We should shift over. This has been way too good of a conversation. All right, so thanks everybody for watching. And if you want to follow Nick, he is on Twitter. Sorry, Professor Nick Groom. Unless you're on a podcast with him, you're not allowed to call him Nick. Just going to say that. It's at twitter.com/ or his handle is prof_Nick_Groom. And you can interact there, of course. I'm sure he'll take some messages if you'd like. And then also, you can pre-order the book. I know it's pre-orderable on Amazon. Yes. Yep. You can pre-order it on Amazon, and we'll put some links down there. Both. Is it different in the UK versus the US? Are there different?
This is one of those funny things. The UK version is called 21st Century Tolkien, What Middle-earth Means to Us Today.
Oh.
Whereas the US edition has a slightly different title, which you will know better than me. So I've not yet seen
Tolkien in the 21st Century, the meaning of Middle-earth.
There you go. They are the same book, except the UK hardback will be the early edition. The US hardback will be the revised edition, which has the extra chapter on the Rings of Power, and also some additional material on why I choose to capitalize in certain ways, and some corrections that many members of the Tolkien Society have suggested I look at again, some of which I agree with, some which I didn't, but I still thank people for engaging with the book.
Yeah, well, the book was great. It goes into such detail, and it's readable. It's not dry or boring, right? Because you're dealing with the issues that Tolkien thought about and things that came up while he was writing and while he was living, and then intersplicing it with all the different facts of what was going on in his life at the time. So I just found it, the details, the readability, it was great. So I highly recommend it. And you can get it on Amazon or get it wherever. I think it's published by Pegasus Books. So we do have our extended podcast, everybody. We're going to jump into that. We're going to go through our 10 confessions from the comfy chair. Nick, I don't know if there's much more to talk about when it comes to what are you drinking there? That looks mighty red. Is that a good?
It's Montepulciano. It's pretty late in the UK at the moment, so that's.
Well, I'm glad we didn't put you to sleep. At least that's good. That's good.
Of course. All right. It's been a real privilege to talk to you. It's been an absolute.
Oh well, no, our privilege is great. And I would be privileged. Boy, I'm really getting good at these segues here. I'd be privileged for you people who are listening. If you want to get the extended podcast, go to theonering.com/member and join up. First month is free, and after that, it's $4 a month. You get access to our Discord channel, our extended podcast. We'll give you a code for discounts on our store if you want to get a Tangmore hat. That's always cool. But yeah, join us there, and we'll jump on into our extended podcast. And Michael, your standard sign off. Go for it.
Take care, freeloaders.
No, that was so sweet. Take care. All right, see you on the other side, everybody.